Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing It Came From the Network. Topic of this It Came From the Network, WCW Halloween Havoc 1997. And if you've been paying attention to the community page on my YouTube channel, you would have seen there were two separate polls put out. First, asking which promotion you would like to see me do a video from, which WCW won. And then secondly, what era of WCW would you like to see a video from? Which the NWO era won, which this falls right in the middle of. This is a pretty interesting show because it's part of the ramp up to Starrcade 97, which in my opinion should have been the ultimate payoff of the NWO and the Sting storyline. And we're going to see little building blocks here in this video. With that being said, if you haven't seen any of my videos before, I grade everything on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 would be the worst, 5 would be the best. Let's jump right into it. First up, we get a match with Yuji Nagada going up against Ultimo Dragon. And it's kind of funny going back, watching Nagada back during this time frame, because I've watched his career for so long and it's so ingrained his look now, which isn't too different from this, but it kind of always feels like Nagada was an old man because he seemed to have been an old man for a little while now. Here we have two absolute legends in Japan. Ultimo was right in the middle of his legendary run. Yuji Nagata was towards the beginning of his legendary run. The crowd really wasn't that into this match, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go along, but I really enjoyed this. I thought the two guys worked well with each other. The submission style of Nagata worked well with the more high-flying style of Ultimo Dragon. Ultimo did have a lot of mat-based talent as well. This is a really fun match. The story with this is Ultimo Dragon recently left Sonny Ono, so Sonny Ono brought in Yuji Nagata as someone to take up for him. Again, kind of weird seeing Nagata as a heel because I always think of him as a face. Nagata does pick up the win here. Afterwards, they do an angle where him and Sonny Ono break Ultimo Dragon's arm. I thought this was really fun. I really enjoyed this. And despite the crowd not being into it, I was really into it. I'm giving this one a 4. Next up, we have a match which they say wasn't an advertised match. We get a very young Chris Jericho, who's still in the Lionheart phase, the ultra white meat baby face, going up against Gato. And much like I talked about Nagata and Ultimo Dragon, Gato is an absolute legend in Japan as well. Obviously from his career in War and FMW, and also in the legendary J-Cup tournaments. His team with Gato and Gato were amazing together, and you may know him now as the booker of New Japan Pro Wrestling for the past several years. I believe it was on his own podcast where Chris Jericho said that Gato being part of New Japan is one of the reasons why he did that initial trip to New Japan and did some wrestling there, where he was basically a WWE guy. So you could say that Gato helped open the forbidden door, which gave us All Elite Wrestling, because Jericho's a big cog in All Elite Wrestling existing, and Gato is a big cog in Jericho doing wrestling outside of WWE. Going back to the match here, they had a really good junior style match. I do feel like they dumbed it down a bit. If you would have seen this on an FMW show or a War show or even a New Japan show at the time, I think they would have paced it up a bit. There would have been a little more high flying moves, a little bit more danger to the match. I think they did dumb it down a bit for the WCW audience, and for that reason and the fact that for the second match in a row the audience didn't seem to care at all, it didn't bother me as much on the first one as it does here, because here it made more painfully obvious that they're trying to pander for a crowd that doesn't really like them. Ultimately, Jericho does pick up a win here. I thought it was a good match, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to bash the match, and this is going to sound very much like the arguments against Dave Meltzer. I would have liked to see this in a different promotion, whether it be one of the aforementioned Japanese promotions of the time, or maybe even ECW. I think we would have got a better match because they would have better planned it for that specific crowd. And not knocking them. They did the absolute right thing by trying to work their match to the crowd they were in front. Just my opinion, I could be wrong. Next up, we get a backstage segment with Mean Gene Okerland interviewing Deborah McMichael. Deborah had recently split off from Mongo McMichael, and the story going here is she's going to have a surprise wrestler to fight Mongo later. Mongo comes in, basically goes back and forth, talks about if you don't need his help, give me my credit card, give me back my ring. A little bit cheesy and soap opera-y, but I thought it was okay. Deborah did really well here. I thought Deborah came off very well, and it's one of those things that you almost forget that Deborah could be a decent promo or a decent manager or valet, because you're more focused on how beautiful she is, because she's an absolutely stunning woman, especially in this time frame. She's still a beautiful woman now. It almost distracts you, and I feel at times with who she was aligned with, specifically Mongo, and no knock on Mongo, I love Mongo. I enjoy him a lot more than most people do wrestling-wise, but I think she would really hit her stride when she was with Jeff Jarrett, and then later on her future husband Steve Austin, which we're not going to talk about that, Austin and Deborah. Nope, staying away from that topic. But you kind of forget, because she was with a guy here that really wasn't ever taken seriously. She went to Jarrett, who was a little more serious, and people obviously noticed her talent. And then when she's with Steve Austin, she's outshined by probably one of the 3 biggest wrestlers in the history of wrestling. Good promo here. Great way to set up a match later on the show. Next up, we have the match that most people probably come back and watch this video for, or watch this pay-per-view or premium live event now for. We get Rey Mysterio Jr. going up against Eddie Guerrero. Rey Mysterio is putting his mask on the line against Eddie Guerrero's Cruiserweight Championship. This is probably one of the most iconic matches in Rey Mysterio's career, and maybe even Eddie Guerrero's career as well. He's wearing the purple Phantom-inspired gear from head to toe, and this was just awesome. I really enjoyed this match. There's a certain excitement that comes from watching a Eddie Guerrero match and a Rey Mysterio match. Even to this day, watching a Rey Mysterio match, you're seeing one of the true pioneers in all of the history of wrestling. You can make an argument that Rey Mysterio is the most popular luchador of all time, and he's definitely in there. He's up there with El Santo, he's up there with Mil Mascaras, and if you're specifically talking about in the United States, he's definitely number 1, and probably all over the world except for Mexico, he's solidly number 1. This is a fantastic match. These 2 guys always worked very well against each other or with each other. They have an obvious natural chemistry. Eddie plays a great heel off of Rey Mysterio's face, which Rey Mysterio is one of the great faces of all time. His face character gets so much sympathy because he's mostly smaller than everybody he ever wrestles. This is a very, very good match. If you only watch one match from this card, go back and watch this because it's definitely worth revisiting. Ultimately, Rey Mysterio picks up the win, getting to keep his mask and also becoming the Cruiserweight Champion in the process. I'm giving this match a 5. I thought it was really good. After that, we get a legendary moment in all of WCW. You've seen this basically every WCW show you would tune into, whether it be Nitro, Thunder, pay-per-views, Clash of the Champions. Mean Gene Okerland comes out and plugs the hotline and talks about wrestlers coming that he can't talk about on air, but if you call later, he'll let you know on the hotline. And I still remember the number, even though they blacked it out here. It's 1-900-909-9900. And don't call that. I have no idea what that goes to nowadays. Please don't call that. I don't even know, are 900 numbers even a thing anymore? Is that still something where people are putting out phone numbers you could call and they charge you? I don't even know. I haven't seen any commercials for it in recent memory, but I could be wrong. It still could be a thing. Either way, please don't call the number because I don't know how much it's going to cost you to do so, if it does still work. After that, we're thrown to a backstage promo, and it's from the NWO locker room, so we get it in black and white with the NWO theme music behind it. We have Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff talking about their match with Roddy Piper later, and if WCW can't guarantee that Sting will not be involved, they're going to walk and they're going to leave without taking the match. This is pretty good. I tend to think that the Hogan promos at this time frame are a little bit over the top and a little bit on the hokey side. Not that they're bad, and not that I didn't understand where he was going with these. I just thought that they were in that realm, just a little bit hokey, a little bit over the top. I thought this conveyed well exactly what they wanted it to. Made Hulk Hogan look like he was a little bit afraid of both Sting and getting in the cage with Piper, a man who historically he had never got the upper hand on. I thought that was really good. good. That leads us right into our match. We have Mongo McMichael going up against Deborah's surprise opponent, and it's Alex Wright. I totally did not remember this happening, and I have to say, and this is no knock on Alex Wright, because there's a lot of stuff in Alex Wright's career I liked. I think he was kind of stuck with a little bit of a bad gimmick and couldn't quite get out of it. I did like his tag team with him and Disco Inferno, the Boogie Nights. I thought that was a great tag team. I loved the idea of those two working together. I even liked when he became Berlin, a somewhat Rammstein / Marilyn Manson inspired character, and yes, I know both of those bands are a little bit problematic nowadays, but I think he was a good wrestler that just never had the right gimmick for him to become much more than a lower card talent, and that's really a shame because I do think he was good. This match, however, was a bit of a mess. There used to be a Twitter page I followed. I'm not sure if I still follow them or even if they still post up anything, where it posted daily Mongo botches, and God bless the guy. I know he's not doing well health-wise, so I even hesitate to talk bad about him a bit, because I don't want to talk bad about the man. I did find him entertaining, and in the ring with certain wrestlers, I thought he could pull off a good match. Here, he looked like a guy with two left feet. He looked like if you asked me to pull off the dance moves from an Usher video, or if you asked me to go and play basketball against the N1 street ball team. I'm gonna look terrible, and that's kind of where Mongo was here. And again, no knock on Mongo. I found him entertaining. This match was a very clunky match, a very, I guess you could say, green match. He was very green here. We get to the end of it. Deborah distracts the referee, which this part really hurt the match itself. While she's distracting him, Goldberg comes in and basically attacks Mongo, spears him, and hits the jackhammer. And the jackhammer came like within that much of actually hitting the referee. And I think it was Charles Robinson, Little Nate. I think he was a ref in this. It might have been Mickey J. It was one of those two. But the camera work did the referee no favor, because you could obviously see him looking back and seeing Goldberg, so then he would force himself to look back at Deborah, and then look back again, still see Goldberg in the ring, but knowing he can't turn around because he can't disqualify Alex Wright, because obviously the finish is Goldberg screwing Mongo McMichael, and he keeps looking, and this went on for a long period of time. It was very obvious and very much hurt the match, along with the clunkiness of the match itself. Alex Wright does pick up the win here. I'm going to give this one a 2. It's just barely above unwatchable, and maybe I'm giving an extra rating because I do enjoy both of these guys. Goldberg, not so much. I've never been a fan of Goldberg. After the match, we see the reason why Goldberg was willing to go along with this, as he destroys Alex Wright on the outside, and then Deborah McMichael gives him Mongo McMichael's Super Bowl ring from the 1985 Bears Championship, which I guess it makes sense. Goldberg never won a Super Bowl ring in his football career, so I guess this is the only way he could get one. This set up one of Goldberg's first feuds, and I think this was actually his first actual feud, was him versus Mongo. I could be wrong, he could have had something before that. I think he had a little mini feud with Hugh Morris in the very beginning, but I think this was the first feud where you seen Goldberg kind of stepping up his level of opponents, which was critical to the rise of Goldberg, but again, for this match, just didn't help it that much. Next up, we get another promo from the NWO locker room. This time, Randy Macho Man Savage and Miss Elizabeth, and they're talking about their sudden death match with Diamond Dallas Page later on in the show, or Savage's match with Diamond Dallas Page. I mean, I really enjoyed this. Who's not going to enjoy the Macho Man Randy Savage and obviously the lovely Miss Elizabeth, who got a little bit of promo time here, which is kind of novel for her. She didn't talk very much. It's an awesome promo. Obviously, it's Randy Savage. It's always going to be great whenever he talks. That leads us to an unsanctioned match. This time we have the aforementioned Disco Inferno. He's going up against Miss Jacqueline in an intergender match, which WCW wouldn't sanction. the state of Nevada wouldn't sanction, which, by the way, they're at the MGM Grand, which is actually a really great venue to see a wrestling show. I really enjoyed this. First, we get to see Jacqueline in her Harlem Heat gear, which was kind of cool. I almost forgot that she was tied with Harlem Heat for a little while. Jacqueline was a pioneer in a lot of ways, especially if you look back at intergender wrestling. She's one of the first people to do it and it not be just like a manager versus valet match. As obvious here, she's wrestling what is considered to be a legitimate wrestler. Disco Inferno was the TV champion at the time. I really enjoyed how they worked this match. The way that Disco treated this, even him being the heel, but not wanting to hit a woman because it's not right to hit a woman, but then being forced into fighting with her, and Disco being Disco and being prideful, being conflicted with himself, and you could tell Disco was really good here. Jacqueline too, don't get me wrong, I'm not throwing this match all on Disco's back. I thought this was a really fun match. Is it as good match-wise as Nagada and Ultimo Dragon earlier, or Ray and Eddie? No, but I did enjoy it, and my enjoyment factor is probably on the level with those matches as well, because the story being told in the match was a fantastic story. Ultimately, Jacqueline picks up the win, which you knew she would. I'm going to give this one a 4 because I rather enjoyed this. I thought this was a great story. Thought it was a good match. Really fun watch. Next up, we have what is a grudge match. Basically, Curt Henning versus Ric Flair. Henning had recently turned on Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen, and he comes out with Ric Flair's robe with the arms cut off. And this was fun. This is an example of two really good wrestlers being able to convey a different gear, a different level, turning it up a notch to give us something where the two hated rivals are willing to go that extra mile to beat each other. Flair's anger is palpable. Henning's outright disdain and dislike of Flair is palpable. This was a really fun match. Ultimately, Flair gets disqualified when Henning's tied in the tree of woe and he's kicking the U.S. Championship into Henning's face, which I like that. I don't mind disqualification finishes when it advances a storyline like it obviously did here, and it was part of the anger of this. Flair continues to beat on Henning after the match. We got referees trying to help him out. Then we see Conan and Vincent, other members of the NWO, basically coming and making the save to get Curt Hennig out of the ring. I thought this did a lot to show how dangerous Ric Flair was and how much of a threat he could be to the NWO, and specifically Curt Hennig. I thought this was a really fun match. Hennig does pick up the win by disqualification, but Ric Flair looks strong coming out of it as well. You give both of them something to talk about. Hennig says, "I beat you." Flair says, "I beat you up." Continues the feud on. I thought this was really good again. I'm giving this a 4 as well. Next up, we have Mean Gene Okerland, and he's coming out. And basically, since Hogan and Bischoff threatened to leave earlier, the commentary has weaved that in and out, talking about are they going to leave, trying to get news from the back if they left already. Gene comes out and he says, "I have a WCW official," and James J. Dillon comes out. And JJ has paperwork with him, which he basically says he guarantees Sting is not going to be there, which brings out Bischoff, who says, "You can't guarantee this," and he storms off in a huff. Obviously, this was during the time there was that power struggle where Bischoff was in charge of WCW, which legitimately he was, but was also in charge of the NWO, so they were kind of weaving in some reality to the storyline here. Again, a nice little piece to first break up the action between matches, so you're not burnt out with just match. Also building for the main event of the show. I thought that was pretty decent. Next up, we have Lex Luger versus Scott Hall, with special guest referee Larry Zbyszko. Hall has 6 with him, aka X-Pac, the 1-2-3 Kid. I seem to remember liking this match more when I initially watched it back in the day, and it could be the fact that I'm a fan of Luger and I'm a mega fan of Scott Hall. I like both of these guys a lot. If you see my community page, which, like I said, is where I did the poll to see what I was going to do for this, which gives you a good reason to go check out the community page if you want to be involved in the decisions on the show. If you see that, I do things like the This Day in Wrestling History, and a lot of times I post stuff about Lex Luger because I kind of feel like Lex Luger is one of those legends that isn't given the the respect or the reverence that he should get. I think he was a lot better than most people make him out to be. Scott Hall, everybody loves. He's universally loved. This match, to me, was a little bit underwhelming, in my opinion. A little bit not lived up to the hype in my head, I guess, when I seen it on paper and knew it was coming up. Ultimately, it breaks down towards the end. Eric Bischoff comes out. Six gets involved. We see Scott Hall seemingly win the match, but then Zbyszko insists on them playing a replay on the Teletron, which, if that's an option, why isn't there a replay on every match? It definitely would have helped out in the Alex Wright and Mongo McMichael match earlier in the show. He restarts the match, and it basically ends up just going to, I guess, Luger, because it ended up breaking down. I'm giving this match a 3. I thought it was good. I guess, in my opinion, in my head, I thought it was going to be better, so for me, I had to knock it down a notch. Next up, we have probably the second most talked about match in a positive light on this card, other than Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero, and that is Randy Savage versus Diamond Dallas Page in a sudden death match, which was basically a falls count anywhere type, no disqualification, no countouts kind of match. Savage has Elizabeth with him. This I really enjoyed, and I love this feud. This is one of my favorite feuds in all of WCW history. The Randy Savage, Diamond Dallas Page feud, to me, for storyline, for payoff, for the in-ring matches, it might be the best feud in WCW. This was a really, really fun match. These two, anytime they got together, put on immaculate matches. DDP has said it himself. Savage helped elevate Diamond Dallas Page so much in this feud that he made Diamond Dallas Page basically the legend that he is today. This was a really, really fun match. Elizabeth gets involved, which brings out Kimberly Page, which they do a little thing, and Kimberly basically drags Elizabeth to the back by her hair. We see Sting, which they say is Hulk Hogan because they seen the Hulk Hogan boots, at some point during this match get involved, ultimately helping Savage get the win over DDP here. I thought this was really fun. I wish they would have just kept it between Savage and DDP and Elizabeth and Kimberly and didn't have the fake Sting involvement, which pays off a bit in the next match. I am going to knock that off just a bit here. I'm giving this one a 4. It's my second favorite match on the card, and it's important in the feud. I just feel like the fake Sting aspect wasn't really needed here. That leads us right into our main event. We get Roddy Piper going up against Hollywood Hulk Hogan in a steel cage match, and this was that weird WCW cage that's about 5 feet off of the ring and looked to be a legitimate 20 feet high, and kind of was the more along the lines of the WWF's blue cage, where it wasn't fencing, it was more of a almost like a jungle gym setup. And I know they use this in a couple different times at a couple different places. I've always preferred the look of the wire mesh cage where they use basically just fencing. To me, that always looked better, and I always like the cage to be right up on the ring, unless it's a specific reason. It's not like a Hell in a Cell. Obviously, it's going to be off the ring because it encompasses the outside. But if you're going to do that, I want you to call the cage something different. I know it's a weird thing. It's a weird OCD I have, and it's similar with what AEW does now. They do their cage where it's a little bit off of the ring too, and it's off-putting to me, in my opinion. I think the cage should cramp you. It should feel like you're trapped. Just my opinion. You could use those cages. You could use them in matches that I think are great, but don't call them a cage. Call them something special, like you could call it a super cage match for all you want. This match is pretty much maligned, and rightfully so. It moves at a glacial pace at times. They rely on their star power, which the crazy thing about this is they're getting a better reaction in this than Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero did earlier in one of the great matches of WCW history, which goes to show you just how important to the fans star power is. And I take that into account. This was not the greatest match. There was a lot of chicanery. We seen multiple Stings come out, which none of them were the real Sting, at least that I could see. Randy Savage gets involved. Piper thwarts all the Stings to thwart Savage, so he could put Hogan in the sleeper and gets a win by sleeper. Famously, in a non-title match that's a main event of a pay-per-view, dumbest idea ever. If I'm going to shell out my hard-earned money, I want there to be something at stake at the end of the night. It doesn't have to be the title. It could have been Hogan shaves his head if he loses, or loser has to leave WCW for 90 days. Anything of importance on the line here. And I know why it's a non-title match. As soon as they said it was a non-title match, you're almost guaranteed Piper's going to win it, because it would be a title match if Hogan was going to win it. After the match, we get a strange moment, and I don't know if this was legit or if it was a plant, but there's a guy in a Sting mask that jumps the railing, climbs into the cage. One of the other fake Stings tackles him, and it's obvious it's a fake Sting because his mask had fallen off, and he doesn't look anything like Sting. So that led me to think that this was a fan that just kind of got lost in the mix because he had the Sting mask on. Doug Dillinger and security come to the cage to get him at some point. But part of this is Hogan and Savage get a hold of him, and Hogan looks like he's throwing wrestling punches at the guy. He looks like he's working with him, so I don't know if maybe he's confused and thinks this is supposed to be one of the fake Stings, or if this was a setup, a plant that was meant to look like a fan that got involved, that got overzealous. Which another thing is, they kept going back to showing this person, which I don't believe even WCW would do at the time. They would cut away from a fan that would get involved. It almost felt like the fan was the focal point because they go off the air with him getting dragged out of the cage, which I can't imagine was how they wanted to go off of the air. I don't know, it was just weird, just surreal. The match itself, I'm going to give a 2. That surreal aspect of it just added to the overall poor quality, in my opinion. Overall, this card had ups and downs. The early part of the card had some great action on it, which was kind of the story of WCW. The early part of the WCW cards with the cruiserweights and the international talents like Dragon, Nagada, Rey Mysterio, they would carry the work rate part of the card, but didn't get quite a reaction as the later part of the card, where the proven talents like Hogan and Piper would have a less interesting match but get a way better reaction, obviously going off of their star power. And that's not saying that all the stars here were in bad matches. DDP and Savage had a good match. Luger and Hall I thought was good. Henning and Flair I thought was really good. But I think they were a little bit outshined by the early portion of the show, match quality wise. I do think this was an up and down card. It definitely hurts that the main event was poor, in my opinion. That hurts the overall value because we're building towards the main event. Overall, I'm going to give it a 3. I think it's a kind of middle of the road pay-per-view. It does feel like it's setting up for Starrcade. We've seen a lot of these storylines carry over into Starrcade. I thought it was good. I definitely recommend going back and watching Yuji Nagata and Ultimo Dragon, Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero, DDP and Savage, even Flair and Henning I recommend going back and watching, even Disco and Jacqueline too, to see a great match psychology-wise. Again, it was up and down. I'm going to give it a 3. That's basically the best I could give it. With that being said, if you made it to the end, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. If you see where it says join, that's how you become a channel member. It definitely would help out the channel if you decided to do that. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know who your favorite NWO member was. Put it down here in the comments, since this is the NWO era. Is it Hogan? Is it Hall? Is it Nash? Is it Vincent? Is it Michael Wall Street? Is it Conan, Bret Hart, Jeff Jarrett? I think there's something like 40 different people that were in the NWO, so I'm not going to name them all here. Let me know your favorite down here in the comments. With that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another It Came From The Network.